My name is Maris Langley. I used to think that being the dependable one, the quiet, steady shoulder, was enough. That if I just kept showing up, someone would notice. But the truth is, sometimes you can give everything and still feel like a guest in your own life. And one day, something small breaks, and you realize it's been broken for years. So if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people you love, stay with me. Listen through the end, and then tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have done the same? I'd really like to know. It was a Saturday morning in late May, the kind of morning where the air already smells like summer, and expectations hang thick like pollen. I should have felt proud, excited, maybe even a little emotional. Instead, all I felt was invisible. The coffee I brewed that morning went cold on the counter. I had laid out my dress the night before. Light beige, simple, something safe. Not too bright, not too dull, just enough to blend in. I remember staring at it and thinking, this isn't my day, but I should still look like I belong in it. That thought didn't age well. I'm Maris Langley, 30 this year. I live alone in a small apartment in Charlotte, not far from my office at Kale Studio, where I manage a team of designers who think I have my life perfectly sorted. Most days, I let them believe that. For the past 8 months, I had been planning my sister Felicity's wedding. From the moment she got engaged, Mom turned to me and said, "You've always had good taste. Why don't you help your sister make this day unforgettable?" And just like that, it became my full-time job after my full-time job. I chose the venue, the Ridge Hall Estate, charming, full of light, with wraparound porches and ivy-covered columns. I worked late into the night, designing invitation templates, helped Felicity pick her dress, negotiated vendor prices, and even paid the down payment on the florist when our parents said they were stretched thin after the engagement party. I told myself it was worth it. That being the dependable one meant something. But that morning, as I pulled up to Ridge Hall, something didn't sit right in my chest. Not nerves, not even anxiety, just distance. Like I was walking into a movie I helped direct but wasn't cast in. The front lawn was already alive with the hum of makeup artists, photographers, bridesmaids, cousins, and distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone moved like they had a mission. I stood there holding a box of last-minute items, Felicity's perfume, a pair of backup earrings, and the lace garter she almost forgot to wear. No one noticed me. Mom walked by, her hands adjusting the floral arch. She glanced over her shoulder and said without stopping, "Stand off to the side. You're getting in the way of their work." Her tone was sharp, distracted, like she hadn't even registered that I'd been up since 6, running around, taking care of errands. Again, no hug, no thank you, no eye contact. I set the box down on a side table, smoothed my dress, and made my way to the seating chart to find my table. My eyes scanned the list 3 times before I saw it. Table 12. Back corner, near the kitchen. Table 12 wasn't for family, it was for overflow. When I got there, I found myself surrounded by great aunts and a couple of old church ladies I barely remembered. One of them, a silver-haired woman, wearing a feathered hat, gave me a polite once-over and asked sweetly, "Are you a friend of the groom's family?" I gave a tight-lipped smile. "Number, I'm the bride's sister." Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, you look so different from the others." Different. The word landed in my stomach like a stone. I gave a polite laugh and sat down, folding my hands in my lap so I wouldn't start picking at my nail polish. Nearby, I overheard Mom chatting with Aunt Laverne. "Felicity's got such natural flair," she said, her voice soaked in pride. "She and her friends planned everything themselves. I didn't lift a finger." I froze. She and her friends didn't lift a finger? I had receipts, email threads, mood boards, spreadsheets. I had canceled dates, skipped weekends, stayed up too late and woke up too early, all to make sure this day went perfectly. But none of it counted if no one remembered it. From where I sat, I could see the head table being prepared. White linens, gold chargers, fresh flowers. Felicity stood in the center, radiant in her gown, surrounded by friends clinking champagne glasses and posing for photos. I kept waiting for her eyes to find mine. They never did. Everyone there knew where they belonged. Bridesmaids were bridesmaids, friends were cherished guests, parents were proud hosts. I was a utility, background support, the one who kept the lights on but never stood in them. I stepped outside, needing air. The sun had risen higher, warming the stone walkway as I wandered toward the side garden. My heels crunched softly against the gravel, and I let my hand brush against the hedge of hydrangeas I had specifically requested. Felicity liked peonies, but they wouldn't hold up in the heat. I had thought of everything, and still I was invisible. Standing there, watching the laughter through the glass doors, it settled in me like a quiet truth. I had planned a wedding that wasn't mine, and maybe it was never meant to be for me, not even as a guest. I stayed out there longer than I meant to, not because I wanted someone to come find me, but because I already knew they wouldn't. When I stepped back inside, the air felt heavier. Not warmer, just denser, like a performance had already begun and I'd forgotten my lines. I moved through the crowd with a polite smile, heading for table 12. It was still tucked away in the back corner, right by the kitchen doors, close enough to smell the garlic and hear the clatter of dishes from behind the scenes. I pulled out the chair with my name card, though even that felt like an afterthought, and sat down slowly. Around me were distant relatives I barely recognized. One woman, probably in her 60s, with a lavender fascinator and a cloud of perfume, leaned toward me and asked with a friendly smile, "Are you a friend of the groom's family?" I paused. "No. I'm Felicity's sister." Her eyes widened. "Oh, you look so different from the others. I just assumed. Well, never mind." She turned back to her dinner roll, buttering it like she hadn't just cracked something inside me. Different. That word stuck. I didn't know if she meant my face, my energy, or just the fact that I wasn't glowing like the rest of the bride's circle. Whatever she meant, it reminded me of every childhood birthday party where I set the table but never blew out the candles. I stared at the centerpiece, pale pink roses and cream peonies. I remembered fighting for those colors, convincing Felicity they'd photograph better than the coral she originally wanted. She only agreed after I showed her a full mock-up. I had decorated this very table, and still, I didn't belong at it. Across the room, laughter echoed from the head table. Felicity looked radiant, exactly how a bride should. Friends surrounded her, cameras flashed, and the champagne flowed freely. I wondered if anyone would notice if I stood up and walked out. Probably not. Or worse, they'd just assume I was one of the staff and ask me to bring more napkins. The man to my left asked me to pass the butter. I did. Then I checked my phone, mostly to avoid making eye contact. A message popped up. "Ria Cantor. Thinking of you today. Don't forget. You matter, even when they pretend you don't." I stared at the words for a while. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed, "Thank you," then deleted it. Typed again, paused, then erased it all. I locked the screen and slid the phone into my clutch. I wasn't used to being seen, not like that. Ria was one of the few people who ever looked at me without expecting something in return. She was my colleague. But more than that, she had this quiet way of noticing things, like when I came in early 3 days in a row and didn't speak much at lunch. She didn't push, just left a granola bar on my desk with a sticky note that said, "Take care." Maybe that was why her message felt heavier than the dress I was wearing. Back in the moment, someone at the nearby table raised a toast. My father, Lowell, had joined a small group of men, friends, I assumed, though I didn't recognize most of them. He was mid-joke when I caught the end of his sentence. "Felicity's always been our little princess. The younger one, you know. Maris. Well, she's more like the royal assistant." The table erupted in laughter. I didn't. I forced a smile. Not for their sake, but because if I didn't, I would cry. And I wasn't going to cry in a room full of people who thought I was someone's +1. Royal assistant. That one stung. Not because it was far off, but because it was too close. I had always been the one behind the curtain, pulling the strings so the show could go on. Suddenly, I heard a voice from the group of bridesmaids nearby. One of Felicity's college friends, dressed in matching mauve chiffon. "Her mom did everything," she said loudly, sipping from a flute of champagne. "Seriously, she's like a wedding ninja. I don't know how she pulled it off." I turned my head, slowly, toward the direction of the voice. My mother was standing right there, talking to a cluster of guests, beaming with pride. She smiled. She nodded. She didn't correct them. She didn't say, "Actually, Maris planned most of this." She didn't say, "My older daughter made this day happen." She didn't say my name at all. Something inside me twisted. Not just hurt, but something older than that. A tiredness, a knowing. This wasn't about being forgotten. This was about being erased. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. My hand was steady. Too steady for what I felt. Across the room, Felicity threw her head back laughing, and I realized I wasn't angry at her. I was just done. The lights dimmed just slightly, enough to make the candles flicker and the centerpieces glow softer. Somewhere near the front, someone tapped a spoon against a champagne glass, once, twice, and the room began to quiet. Conversations faded into murmurs. The clinking of forks stopped. All eyes turned toward the mic. It was time for the speeches. I felt it before I heard it, the familiar tightening in my chest. The kind of brace your heart moment where you hope for nothing, just to protect yourself. But deep down, a part of you still waits, still wishes. Mom walked up first. Her heels clicked lightly against the wood floor. She looked beautiful, elegant in that poised way she always held herself in public, like every movement had been rehearsed in the mirror. "We are so incredibly blessed," she began, her voice clear, like she was narrating a commercial for a perfect family. "To have a daughter like Felicity. From the moment she came into our lives, she's brought us joy, laughter, a sense of beauty and light and possibility." She paused, hand over her heart. The room was still. I heard someone sniffle. Applause followed, warm and immediate. A few guests wiped at their eyes. I didn't move. I didn't clap. She never mentioned the planning, never mentioned the months of spreadsheets, the late-night calls with vendors, the dress fittings I took time off work to attend. Never once acknowledged that the beauty and possibility she praised so highly had been, in part, crafted by my hands. Dad was next. He kept it short. "We're proud," he said, adjusting the mic with a small shrug. "Today is everything we'd hoped for. Felicity, you make us proud every day." And that was it. The napkin on my lap was twisted tight in my hands. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. My knuckles were white. My stomach churned like I'd swallowed something that didn't belong to me. Felicity stood up next. Glowing, of course. She looked like a magazine cover. Soft curls, perfect smile, a dress that shimmered like it had been stitched with stardust. She thanked the guests, her bridesmaids, her college roommates, even the florist. Then she looked at Mom and said, "Thank you for making this day perfect. You've done everything. I couldn't have asked for more." That was the moment. The splinter, not a crack, not yet, but a delicate fracture that ran through the core of me. A quiet break, like when you overbend a spoon and it gives, slowly, before it snaps. I don't remember the rest of her speech. I think I chose not to. Around me, people clapped and laughed and raised glasses. The music picked up. Couples moved toward the dance floor, hands finding hands. Cameras flashed. Servers began pouring more wine. I sat still, the napkin now a crumpled knot in my lap. Then I stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just quietly. No one looked. No one asked where I was going. I walked between tables, past a bridesmaid fixing her lipstick in a phone screen, past cousins telling jokes in the corner. The music changed. That's when I heard it. The opening notes of that song. A soft, lilting piano melody. My favorite as a child. I used to hum it while setting the table, helping Mom with dinner, folding laundry in the back room. It was never on the radio, never anyone else's favorite, just mine. I froze mid-step. Of all the songs in the world, that was the one she chose for her waltz. She never asked. I took a breath, kept walking, past the laughter, past the shimmer of lights bouncing off glassware. My hands trembled, but my steps didn't. I didn't want to cry in there. Not in the middle of the room I'd helped build. Not surrounded by people who only noticed you when you were useful. Outside, the air was cooler. The sky held that late evening hue. Rosy, then blue, then gray. The kind of sky that feels honest. I reached my car. Sat in the driver's seat, door still open, feet on the gravel. And then it hit me. Not the kind of cry where tears trickle gracefully. The kind that comes from someplace deeper. The kind that heaves out of you like breath after a long, cold plunge. I let it. For once, I didn't try to be quiet or composed. I let the sobs shake my body. Let the grief I'd swallowed for years crawl out of me like it had finally found the way. When it eased, just barely, I reached for my phone. I called Mom. No answer. I called Dad. He picked up, but his voice was flat. "Today's a happy day, Maris. Let's not make it about drama, all right?" He hung up. That was it. No pause. No, "Are you okay?" Just a brick wall where connection was supposed to be. I looked down at the phone, the screen still lit. Then I whispered, not even surprised. Something shifted in that moment, not all at once, but enough. It wasn't just that I didn't belong there. It was that I had spent too long begging for a seat at a table I helped set, and they never once saved me a chair. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and quietly, without saying it out loud, I made a decision. They had made their choices. Now, I would make mine. The apartment was still warm when I stepped inside, like it had been holding its breath the entire day, waiting for me to come home and exhale first. I didn't turn on the lights. Just the hallway glow behind me was enough to guide my steps. I slipped off my shoes without unbuckling them, let my purse fall gently beside the console table, and stood there for a while, hands still curled, as if holding something I no longer needed. I listened for a sound that would make the silence feel less lonely. Traffic outside, the hum of the fridge, even my own breath. But the air inside felt thick and still. And in that stillness, I realized something strange. I wasn't relieved to be home. I was just untethered. I walked to the bedroom in slow steps, peeling off the reception dress like it had been clinging to me in more ways than fabric. The zipper stuck halfway. I didn't fight it. I let it hang from one shoulder and made my way to the closet. Pinned on the inside of the door was the mood board I'd created 8 months earlier. My hands had spent hours there, cutting florals, matching tones, handwriting sample cards, organizing them into symmetry. I remembered being proud of it once, like maybe I was building something beautiful, even if I wasn't the one who'd stand in it. Now, looking at it under the dull ceiling light, it felt like a shrine to a version of me that no longer fit in her own life. I stared at it, trying to feel proud again. I couldn't. Without thinking, I reached up and tore it straight down the center. The paper resisted. It didn't rip easily, like even the board wanted to stay whole. But I yanked harder. It finally gave way, loud, ugly. Pieces fluttered to the floor like leaves. Some curled at the edges, landing face down. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like honesty. I didn't cry. Not this time. There was a numbness that felt heavier than grief. A strange calm, like I'd finally stopped waiting for someone to say thank you. I walked to the bathroom, wiped off my makeup in slow, steady circles, as if scrubbing away a face I'd painted for someone else's celebration. Then, I put on the oldest pajamas I owned and wrapped myself in the living room blanket, the one I used when I was sick or needed comfort, but never admitted I needed anything. I curled up on the couch. Not to sleep, just to be held by something that didn't expect me to give anything back. The doorbell rang. I jolted upright, heart pounding in that way it does when you're not expecting anyone. A small, stupid part of me thought, maybe it's them. Maybe someone noticed. Maybe someone came to say sorry. But when I opened the door, it was Rhea. She wore jeans and a cardigan, hair pulled up in a loose bun, and held a paper bag in one hand and a bakery box in the other. "I brought cake," she said, "and tea bags, and presents." I stared at her for a moment, then stepped aside and let her in. No questions, no words. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and detergent. And something else, like disappointment that had settled too deep into the walls. We didn't sit at the table. We carried the cake out to the balcony. The night air was crisp but not cold, and the city lights blinked like tired eyes. She lit a small cinnamon candle and placed it between us. She opened the bakery box. Hummingbird cake, 2 forks. "I didn't go," she said, "to the wedding. Not that I was invited. But even if I had been, I think I would have left early." I smiled. Just barely. "I don't know why I stayed as long as I did," I whispered. She didn't ask. She didn't need me to unpack it. She just passed me a fork and waited, like someone who understood that sometimes silence is the safest answer. I took a bite, let the sweetness melt without tasting it fully. Then, slowly, I said it. The thing I'd never said aloud. "I never asked to be the strong one," I murmured. "I just learned no one else was going to be." She nodded, steady and quiet. Then she told me her own story. The brother who was always forgiven. The mother who never asked how she was doing, just what she could help with. The invisible labor that only became visible when she stopped doing it. How she left home at 25 and didn't go back for Christmas, didn't send cards, didn't explain. "There's a certain kind of silence," she said, "that builds inside you when your value is only measured by what you give." I didn't answer. I just looked out at the city, the flicker of porch lights on other balconies, and felt seen. We toasted with tea from my fridge, lukewarm and oversteeped. "Not to weddings," she said softly. I smiled. Number to endings. And maybe beginnings. We sat there a long while, side by side. No need for filler words, just the quiet understanding of 2 women who had learned how to hold too much for too long. When she finally stood to leave, she turned to me at the door and asked, "If you could leave it all behind, would you?" I didn't have an answer, so I didn't speak. I just nodded, faintly, and closed the door behind her. Later that night, close to 2 a.m., I turned on my laptop and stared at my bookmarks bar. There it was, the scholarship link, right where I'd left it 2 years ago. A program in Copenhagen I had once let myself imagine, then tucked away like it belonged to someone braver. I clicked it, scrolled slowly, read every word like it was a promise, then hovered over the application link with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And this time, I didn't close the tab. I didn't sleep that night. Not even a minute. I lay in bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, the screen glowing like it knew too much. The walls around me felt closer somehow, like the room was breathing slow and heavy, waiting for me to admit something I'd buried too deep. I had opened the scholarship application hours ago. The cursor blinked on the same sentence I'd written earlier, a carefully crafted paragraph about my dedication to community-focused design. It sounded right. It sounded like someone who had her life together. But the more I read it, the less I believed it. It wasn't that the facts were wrong. I had done those projects. I had led those teams. I had poured myself into every space that needed me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had never really been in any of it. Not fully, not honestly. Because while I was designing for others, supporting others, organizing and smoothing and fixing, I was erasing myself. The truth I hadn't written was this. I didn't know who I was when I wasn't being useful. I opened a blank document. The words came slower than I expected, like they had to squeeze past something tight in my chest. But they came. I don't know who I am when I'm not carrying this family on my back. I don't know what I want if I'm not being useful to someone else. but I'm tired. And for once, I want to choose something for me, even if no one claps or says thank you. Especially then. I reread it 3 times, then copied it into a note on my phone. I didn't want to lose it, even if I wasn't ready to submit it. At least, that's what I thought. But in a moment of clumsy half-focus, my thumb brushed the wrong button. Sent. To my mother. I froze. Everything inside me went still. My heart didn't even race. It just stopped, like it was listening too. The message was marked as delivered. Then, read. I stared at the screen, willing the universe to reverse time, to pull the words back, to pretend it never happened. Then the phone rang. Her name lit up on the screen. I picked up without thinking. Her voice was low, controlled, but tight around the edges, like a lid on a pot that's about to boil over. "What is this, Maris?" I said nothing. "I mean it. Are you really still upset about the wedding? After everything we've done for you, you're going to throw all this back at us like a child?" I took a breath. "It wasn't a tantrum," I said, soft but steady. "You left in the middle of the reception. No one noticed I was there." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "That's not true. You're being dramatic. This whole thing, you're blowing it out of proportion. It was one day." I closed my eyes. "No, Mom. It wasn't one day. It was every day I've ever been expected to show up, hold it together, never ask for anything." Silence. "You always expect me to be okay, to be the adult, to be the helper. And when I finally ask for space, or acknowledgement, or just room to breathe, suddenly I'm the one making things difficult." "Oh, for heaven's sake," she started, but I didn't let her finish. "No, Mom, I didn't leave the party. I left the role you cast me in." There it was. No screaming, no drama, just truth. There was a pause, a long one, then, click. She hung up. I stared at the screen for a while, unsure whether I felt lighter or just more hollow. Eventually, I set the phone down. Not with anger, not even with sadness. Just with finality. I walked to the bathroom, turned on the light. The woman in the mirror looked worn out, mascara smudged, hair undone. But underneath all that, there was something steadier in her eyes. A clarity I hadn't seen in a long time. I touched the mirror with 2 fingers and whispered, "You don't have to earn your worth." Not anymore. It didn't echo, it didn't feel triumphant, but it felt true. I had spent so many years trying to be enough for people who never said what enough looked like, who only loved me when I made things easier for them, who praised my strength not because it was beautiful, but because it was convenient. I wasn't done loving them, but I was done loving them in ways that asked me to disappear. I left the light on as I crawled back into bed. This time, I didn't open the application, didn't edit or polish or try to sound impressive. I just let the silence settle around me, and I let myself believe. That being still didn't mean being weak. That being honest didn't mean being cruel. That choosing myself wasn't abandonment. It was return. To someone I hadn't been allowed to become. And for the first time in a long, long while, that was enough. The email came just after noon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still in my robe, sipping the same cup of coffee I'd reheated 3 times. The subject line popped up like any other. Copenhagen Design Fellowship. Application status. I stared at it for a good 30 seconds before I clicked. The message was short, almost clinical. I'd been awarded a partial scholarship to attend the fall program in Copenhagen. The rest would be up to me. Tuition balance, housing, flights. But it was real. A chance to start over. A door cracked open. My first reaction wasn't joy. It was fear. I thought of all the reasons not to go. I didn't speak Danish. I'd never lived outside the country. Who would water my plants? What if something happened while I was gone? What if, somehow, they needed me? But the truth settled quickly, and it was colder than fear. They didn't need me. Not the way I had believed. They needed a version of me. The dependable one. The fixer. The quiet, useful shadow that held everything together and asked nothing in return. That version of me was tired. Before I could spiral too far, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. Maris? Felicity's voice, high and tight, like she'd been crying, or wanted me to believe she had. I just found out you applied for some school thing. Is that true? I blinked. Yeah, I got in. There was a pause. So you're leaving? Just like that? I haven't bought the ticket yet. She exhaled, and I could almost hear her pacing. Mom's been crying all week, she said. You know that, right? You walked out of my wedding, and now you're, what? Running away to Europe? Why couldn't you just be happy for me, like always? I held the phone tighter. My voice shook when I answered, but I didn't let it break. Because I was never allowed to be happy for myself. That landed like a thud. A long silence followed. I thought she might say something softer, something real. But instead, she scoffed. You always made yourself the victim. Maybe this is your thing now. And that was it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just said, goodbye, Felicity. Then I hung up, blocked the number, and set my phone down like it was something that didn't belong to me anymore. The room was quiet again. I walked to the window and looked out over the street, where nothing had changed, but everything inside me had. There's a kind of peace that comes after the storm, but there's also a kind that comes from choosing the storm in the first place. I didn't know what was waiting for me in Copenhagen, but I knew what was here. The same roles, the same guilt, the same patterns passed off as love. I didn't want that anymore. I picked up the phone and called Ria. She answered on the first ring. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. So, I got the scholarship. I know, she said. I saw it in your eyes last night. You already knew you would. I laughed quietly. I think I'm ready to stop being someone else's support beam. There was a pause. Then, softly, then it's time to fly, Maris. I opened my laptop, typed in my departure city and destination, picked a flight, 2 weeks out. Enough time to wrap up loose ends, not enough time to second guess. The confirmation email arrived within minutes. I sat back in my chair and stared at it. It wasn't just a flight. It was my name on something that wasn't about anyone else. Something that didn't exist to hold someone else up. Something that said, I'm allowed to go. And this time, I would. I spent the last 3 days before my flight dismantling my life, bit by bit. Not dramatically. No tears, no music playing in the background. Just me, a roll of packing tape, and the quiet realization that I'd outgrown the version of myself I'd been asked to keep playing. I sorted everything into neat little piles. Clothes I'd wear in Copenhagen, books I couldn't part with, trinkets I thought I cared about until I held them in my hands and felt nothing. It's funny how much we keep, not because we need it, but because we think someone might notice if it's gone. The suitcase sat open on my bed, half full, like it was waiting for me to get scared and stop. But I wasn't scared. Not in the way I thought I would be. I was tired. Tired of carrying the emotional weight of a family that had learned to love me best when I made myself small. I didn't tell them I was leaving. Not to be cruel, but because I'd finally learned the difference between honesty and explanation. I didn't owe them one more script to revise, one more version of myself to soften so they could swallow it easier. The apartment felt different without the noise. I had unplugged the TV and turned off the radio. Even the hum of the fridge felt intrusive. There was a strange comfort in the silence, like being in a room that finally understood how much I needed to be alone. On the second afternoon, while wrapping the last of my books in brown paper, ones I'd reread during nights when I needed to feel less invisible, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my father. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a week. His shirt was tucked in, collar slightly wrinkled, like he'd left work in a hurry but hadn't wanted to seem unprepared. He didn't say hello. Didn't step inside. His eyes moved past me, scanning the apartment like he was trying to recognize something. Maybe the girl who used to always be available, or maybe just the pieces of a life he never really asked about. So, he said after a pause, you're really doing this? I nodded. He nodded too, slower, then looked down at the floor, like it might offer him the words he couldn't find. Your mother, she's not taking it well. I figured, I said, leaning against the doorframe. She thinks you're doing this to hurt us. I looked him in the eye. I'm not leaving because of her. I'm leaving because of me. He didn't disagree, but he didn't agree either. He just stood there, caught in that quiet place between what he felt and what he was allowed to say. I took a deep breath. And what about you, Dad? I asked. Can you live with it? Watching me shrink year after year, always the helper, always the backup plan. Did that ever bother you? He looked up sharply, like I'd spoken a language he hadn't heard in a long time. Then he rubbed the back of his neck, the way he used to when we were kids, and he didn't have an answer that fit neatly into a fatherly role. This time, he didn't even try. He just gave a small nod, turned around, and walked back to his car. No hug, no, I understand. No, we'll miss you. Just the soft sound of retreating footsteps and the door closing gently behind me. But for once, I didn't feel rejected. I didn't feel punished. His silence wasn't aimed at me. It was his own reckoning. The quiet of a man who had spent a lifetime keeping peace, not realizing he'd built it on someone else's sacrifice. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, but from something more complicated. A slow ache for the version of me that used to believe love meant disappearing. Around 9 p.m., there was another knock. This time, it was Rhea. She didn't say much, just walked in, holding a brown paper bag and a soft, folded bundle. I figured you'd forget to pack anything warm, she said with a small smile. Inside was a hand-knit scarf, deep forest green, flecked with golden threads. Heavy, comforting. Like someone had seen me fully and still thought I deserved softness. I touched the yarn gently. I didn't expect this. She looked at me for a long moment. Maybe it's time you started expecting more. We sat on the couch for a while, shoulder to shoulder, no need for conversation. She didn't ask what I was feeling, didn't offer advice. Just sat there, letting her presence speak the language of steady kindness. The next morning, the city was still yawning when the car pulled away from the curb. My suitcase in the trunk, the scarf around my shoulders, Charlotte slowly fading in the rearview mirror. I looked out the window at the quiet streets I'd walked for years. The same stoplight I used to pause at after long workdays. The same diner I always meant to try but never did. And I didn't feel guilty. I wasn't running. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was choosing me. Leaving isn't the betrayal. Staying in a place that asks you to disappear? That would be. The waiting area at Charlotte Douglas was quiet in that particular early morning way. People too tired to talk, too focused on boarding passes and coffee lids to notice anyone else. I sat by the window, my scarf from Rhea wrapped around my shoulders, suitcase tucked neatly at my feet. The glass beside me reflected a soft gray sky. Everything looked still. I checked my phone one last time. There it was, a new message from my mother. We're still your family, don't forget that. I stared at it. Not long, just enough. Then I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the seat next to me. Not out of anger, not even sadness, really. Just nothing. The kind of nothing that comes after you've emptied yourself of trying. There had been a time when a message like that would have broken me open. When I would have replied instantly, desperate to explain myself, to make her see me. That time had passed. I leaned back and watched a little boy across from me trying to fit a stuffed giraffe into his tiny backpack. He must have been about 6, wide-eyed and talkative. At one point, he looked over and asked, "Is it your first time flying?" I smiled, surprised. Not really, but it's the first time I'm going somewhere that feels right. He tilted his head. Like vacation? Not just going far, I said softly. Going true? He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. Kids are funny that way, intuitively kind without needing to know the full story. As the boarding call echoed overhead, I gathered my things. The airport gate was a blur of people, but I moved slowly, with purpose. Every step felt like a decision I was no longer second-guessing. I passed through the tunnel that connects the terminal to the plane, the cool air pressing against my skin. I thought back to every version of me that had turned around before she ever got this far. Not this time. When I reached my seat and sat down, I pulled out the small journal Ria had given me the night before. It was bound in soft leather, with a green ribbon tied around the front. Inside the front cover, in her handwriting, were the words, "Design a life where you're not just useful, but joyful." I ran my fingers over the page like it was something sacred. Not a command, not a challenge, just an invitation, one I was finally saying yes to. As passengers filled in around me, I looked out the window. The runway stretched ahead like a blank page. No expectations, no obligations, just sky. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation. My mother would continue on, perhaps wondering if I'd come back, perhaps rewriting the story in her mind. Felicity would return to her routines, maybe noticing that things didn't run quite as smoothly without me there to hold them together. Or maybe not. None of that was mine to carry anymore. What I had now was something quieter, but stronger. The engines hummed. The plane began to move. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes, just for a moment. As we lifted off the ground, I whispered to myself, I thought I was running away, but maybe I was finally coming home. To myself. I don't know where this story finds you. Maybe you're someone who's always been the strong one too. The one who keeps the peace, who says yes when you're tired, who's learned to disappear just enough to make others comfortable. If you are, I hope you know this. Your worth doesn't depend on how much you give or how quiet you stay. It's okay to choose yourself. It's okay to walk away from roles that no longer fit. Have you ever felt like that? Like leaving was the first real step toward coming home? If this story spoke to something inside you, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one. There's more to tell, more to heal, and I'd love for you to be there.